Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Agile Ideas for 2021. I'm Fatima, CEO at Agile Management Office, Mental Health Ambassador, and your host. This podcast is sponsored by Agile Management Office, providing high impact delivery execution in an agile era for scaling businesses. On today's very first episode, we have the lovely Rachel Colla. Rachel is a wellbeing, motivation, and performance specialist whose work has spanned multiple sectors, including corporate, health, education, and not-for-profit. As a trained psychologist, she has extensive experience in bringing the science of optimal performance and well-being to life to assist both individuals and organizations to thrive. Rachel is an experienced facilitator and coach with expertise in goal setting and achievement, leadership development, and well-being. In addition to being Director of Merakai consultancy, she is part of the teaching team at the Centre for Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne in both their postgraduate and undergraduate programs. Rachel was recently awarded a Melbourne Graduate School of Education Award for outstanding achievement in teaching, skill, and imagination in the design and the evaluation of teaching programs. You can contact Rachel Colla at her business website, www.merakai, that's merakai.com.au, or you can find her on LinkedIn by searching for Rachel, that's RACHEL hyphen Colla, COLLA. Now, welcome Rachel to the show. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Very excited to be here with you guys.
I'm very keen to talk to you, as I mentioned before the call, about a number of different things. I think your areas of expertise will be invaluable for our audience. But before we go in further, I just wanted to know, how are you doing? You've probably spent a bit of time in and around the COVID bubble and everything that's going on. How are you and your family?
Oh, thank you for actually asking that. That just really warms my heart, because I think that is one of the things that I've really seen come out of the COVID pandemic is a much more grounded sense of us connecting with one another. So it delights me to hear you start with that. I am doing really well. Last year I was struggling, and so I have just come off the back of 3 weeks of reconnection and rejuvenation time, and I can't tell you how important that is to my own health and well-being, but my energy levels to be able to kick into what we know will continue to be, a really complex and ever-changing year again. So I'm actually doing really well. So thank you for asking.
It's amazing. I think there's been a lot of things that are negative that have come out of COVID, and a lot of stress and pressures. But at the same time, I think there's been some opportunities for some positive stories that have also come out of the COVID situation. What have you been seeing or hearing from, the people that you work with in your work in and around this sort of COVID situation?
Yeah. In what kind of context do you mean, in terms of how they're coping, or?
Yeah, I guess at the moment we're seeing sort of a rise in the number of people that are sort of suffering through anxiety and depression. I think I read earlier there was 30% those that are having medium to high symptoms. I'm one of those people that have the anxiety. I'm curious to know, sort of from the people that you work with or your students, what are you seeing sort of is taking place in and around the last sort of 9 to 12 months?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I had a very robust discussion with my family at Christmas time about the increase of the mental health crisis. And my robust discussion was, and I suppose I've seen this across the board in terms of where we're working in COVID, both in the university sector where I work predominantly, as well as the organisations that I work with. And what I would describe it is that COVID has shone a light on the cracks that already exist within our society. And we see that in terms of those that are sleeping rough. We see that in terms of the issues that we have already had for many, many years in aged care. And we absolutely see it in terms of the issues that we've had in mental health for a significant period of time. So we've had a mental health crisis for a long time. It's just that COVID has actually shone a light on that. It's provided a platform to be able to see some of that. And obviously it has absolutely increased, and there are significant issues that we need to be genuinely concerned about. But I think the reality is we should have been concerned for a long time. And now I think it's starting to get the attention that it's probably really deserved, and hopefully some of the funding to follow that in terms of initiatives.
Absolutely. It's been incredible to see the amount of funding that's now come our way. Obviously, there's already been a lot of funding to organisations like Beyond Blue and whatnot, but
Mm-hmm.
the increase in funding has actually been quite beneficial. On a personal note, seeing the opportunities of mental health plans, which enables people to see psychologists at a rebated cost, has increased significantly. And I know several family members and people in the community that have taken that up. So I think you're absolutely right. There's been a significant increase in attention on it, and it's actually helping sort of our cause as a volunteer for Beyond Blue in the work that you do to reduce that stigma that
Absolutely.
typically is.
Yeah.
So
that is actually one of the joys I think that I have seen happen in the last year is that reduction in stigma, and the fact that it is okay to say, I'm not okay. I can't imagine myself a year ago sitting in a professional podcast and being asked the question, how are you? And me saying, actually, in the last year, I've really struggled. I can't imagine doing that.
yeah.
And yet I work in this industry, right?
Yes.
So I think that normalization of being able to say, I'm both and. I'm both really good now,
Yeah.
and I've been struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're only 15 days into 2021, and although we wish that the COVID pandemic was over, it's not, it's still going, but although improving in our country, what's the best thing that's happened to you so far this year, or what's a positive for the last 15 days?
That's a really good question. I would say a positive for me for the last 15 days, and remember I've just come off holidays, so it's probably coloured by that, is actually a genuine opportunity to reconnect with loved ones. And again, I see that something that has probably, again, more come out of the highlighting of some of the issues in COVID is the importance of that connection. And I think we're getting far more creative about how we do that. So super excited to be catching up with, friends that I haven't seen for over a year, and just that opportunity to be able to be together, not always virtually, but actually in that face-to-face environment is something I'm super excited about.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I've seen an increase ever since the restrictions for us eased in Melbourne, particularly quite significantly. I think I've had one or two events every week consistently, and I'm actually getting quite exhausted from all these events. So it's been great, though. Don't get me wrong. I wouldn't change it. So, but it's been really, really positive. So I've told people a little bit about yourself, and I know that you do a lot of work in positive psychology, but for some of our listeners, they may not be really clear on what that is. Can you share a little bit of insight? What is positive psychology?
I will start by saying that it's probably a term that I don't love, just to kind of put that out there right from the outset, and let me tell you a bit more about why that is. The field itself, or positive psychology as a term, is really used as an umbrella term to describe the science behind what actually leads to optimal functioning. And that science piece is really important, right? But as a field, it actually only evolved just over 2 decades ago now. So it's relatively young in terms of that from a discipline perspective. And I guess it really arose in response to the focus of traditional psychology on all the aspects that require healing and that require attention from, a suffering perspective, which is really fundamentally important. And the term positive psychology was really designed, I guess, to swing that pendulum to equally be able to look at some of the factors that are important around the good life and what does lead to us being well and being whole. But the downside of that terminology, positive psychology, is it tends to indicate that everything that is not positive psychology is negative. And that's not the fact at all. And it's indeed not even the intention of the field. So as a perspective, as opposed to just a discipline, positive psychology, or the concepts around it, have been around for eons, right back to Aristotle's time. We're not talking about anything new. What is new is the science that underpins that, and understanding it more from an evidence-based perspective.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's been really helpful, and I know that you do use that to empower workers, and also you do work with students as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what aspects of positive psychology that you use to empower workers?
Wow, that's a really broad question, because I would say my work with organisations is always bespoke. So what's really important for me is understanding the context. And I think that's one of the things that we haven't always done as well as a discipline in positive psychology. We're doing a lot more of that now, is understanding more the contextualized ways in which we can actually approach that. So my consultation with organizations is always to understand, I guess, the nuances of what's going on for them, and then how we can tailor some of those important science-based factors to support their goals. I think in organisations, it's always important that any training initiative, education initiative, even change initiative is really aligned to what the goals of the organisation are if we're going to get real traction.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think also that it appears to be very heavily dependent on the culture at that point in time as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think if we think about, there's readiness for change and there's readiness opportunities, right? And I think it is about really discerning where those opportunities are so you can get those leverage points early on. I think getting a few of those wins early on is always helpful in terms of creating that shift.
It's building, and it helps to build the trust as well with your workers to empower them. Yeah, absolutely. What do you see as sort of the most prevalent issues, maybe in the last sort of 12 months or 2 years, with regards to the workplace environment? And you've obviously been doing a lot of work in that space. What are some of the prevalent issues that you're seeing in the workplace?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would actually say my time is probably more equally split these days. I think earlier on in my career, it was far more oriented just in the organisational space. And now it's very much split across education and organisations. But if I think about the things that I've been asked to consult on and support organisations in the last kind of 12 months, I would say the majority has been around how do we build capacity for resilience, particularly in the face of uncertainty. And I laugh at this because this is obviously pre-COVID, right? COVID is just one example of the likes of uncertainty that we've been facing for many, many years. So often organisations are saying, what do we need to do to be able to build the capacity of our team to be able to thrive in that environment, right? Not just kind of have their noses above the water and surviving, but how do we actually build that capability for them to be able to navigate through that on an ongoing basis?
It's actually really case in point, the whole COVID pandemic, because resilience has been probably one of the most important skills personally that have needed, and many other people as well. Do you have any suggestions for how people can build resilience? It's a skill that you can get better at and improve. Is there anything that you can recommend to people to build their resilience over time?
Oh, gosh, again, I would say there's a whole variety of different strategies that we can do to build that. And honestly, it depends on the aspects of our resilience that need that fundamental support. So I will often, if I'm thinking about some of the clients that I work with, it is very much about exploring what is going on for them to be able to support them in that environment. We know that social supports are fundamental to building resilience. So it can actually be looking at who is in that close-knit circle of connection that we can tap into. And remember that they don't always need to be close by in terms of location. That's, again, one of the things I think that's really, come out is who can we tap into to be able to provide us with that support. And oftentimes it's actually also about looking at our own values and how the work we're doing is aligned to that. So kind of coming back to that sense of meaning and purpose that can actually help us to push through the challenges that we're talking about. I often talk about the value of post-traumatic growth, right? That it's not just about saying, let's push away any of the traumatic issues, but rather how do we grow through that? How can we actually learn and develop in a way that becomes part of who we are moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Learning from the lesson effectively.
Absolutely.
And so with some of the other side of the coin in the sort of academic space, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing in that space at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I'm pretty much 50-50 split between the time that I work at the University of Melbourne, and I work as a teaching specialist there. So that means I effectively translate the evidence and the science base into really practical ways that students can actually put that into their own lives and learn to apply that in other contexts. So I teach into our undergrad programs, but also our postgrad programs, both like the professional certificate as well as the master's level programs.
And so I assume from having both the practitioner side and working in the corporate space as well as the academic side, you'll be at a significant advantage because you're actually taking real life learnings and putting them into practice every single day. That must be really rewarding.
Thank you. It is. And it's actually why I continue to have a discussion with the university about why I won't go more than 0.5, because for me, it's always really important. And I suppose this is probably speaking to who I am as a person. I often describe myself as a pracademic, right? That I am really interested in the research and the science that underpins these concepts. but it needs to translate in a way that is practical and actionable. And I think that if I become too involved in the academic area, for me, this is just me personally, right? I will lose that capacity to be able to translate and think about how that actually is important in a real life environment. So I often think that my practice continues to inform my research in a way that becomes far more rich because it's grounded in what I'm actually seeing in schools, in organisations.
Yeah, I agree. I think for those that don't know, academic, practitioner, academic, I think it's essential for anyone that is, working in the academic space to have that touch point with the sort of practical side in corporate, and you're actually doing it, both of them at the same time, which is, really, really amazing. I think there's probably a lot of leverage of knowledge that the students will benefit from you taking back, the case studies and the stories. And giving them. We did some work like that with the university in Denmark, and it was really sort of eye-opening for the students because they got to experience real life case studies, not sort of stories that were made up and hoping that they'll get the message across. I think going back to the corporate space, we work with a lot of executives, a lot of C-level executives in tier 1 and tier 2 companies, and I often find there's a lot of discussion, and there's probably an increase in discussion over the last years around culture. And we want to improve our culture, and we want to drive better culture and improve our behaviors and whatnot. Do you see there's a lot of sort of talk and not as much action from sort of your exposure? And why do you think that is?
Absolutely. I mean, of course, the answer is yes, and we all know that because we've all seen many, many organisations where that is the case. But what I would put to you is, we as human beings can see through that, right? So we are far more intuitive. We are far more non-verbal than we are actually verbal. And so you can have plenty of leaders that that talk the talk. If their actions are not congruent with that, we see through that very, very quickly. We might not always be able to articulate what it is, but we feel it almost in our body, right? That something is not right, and there's that breakdown in trust. And if we think about what is most important for leaders, foundational is that they can have a sense of trust with their teams. Yeah. In fact, if we look at all of the high-performing teams, having that sense of psychological safety or trust is one of the top factors that actually leads to high performance. So if we're not willing to actually walk the walk, and there's this breakdown in the level of trust, that has an impact on our team's performance.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, I think culture is fundamental, but remember that culture starts with us as well. Many of the organisations that I talk with will say culture comes from top down, right? Yeah. And there's absolutely no doubt that there are really important factors that influence that. But culture reflects the way we work with one another and interact with one another on a day-to-day basis. So it comes from bottom up as well. Yeah. And we can actually shift the way we respond in that environment.
Do you think that sort of ingrained cultures can change with some help, particularly when they've been like that for quite a while? I've seen some organizations with some really interesting cultures that maybe are not conducive for myself, for example. Can you see, or have you seen organizations make a transformative shift?
I have, but I'll put some context around that. In fact, I think of one of the clients that I worked with that absolutely shifted, but it was a 5-year project, just so you know. So we often think about, I like to say that absolutely organisations can shift, but we need to think about the timeline that we're actually talking about. When we think about individual change, that can happen in a much shorter period of time. If we're thinking about organisational change, we really are talking years, right? Yep. If we're thinking about systems changes, like things like education system, we're talking decades.
Yep.
So it's about shifting not can it or can't it, to instead thinking about what is the timeline that is reasonable to expect some of those changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't change overnight, not with something so well ingrained effectively.
And it's complex. Changing culture is really complex. It's not just let's roll out a little change project or a little positive culture training program, and therefore the culture will change.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I've seen as well is a lot of the time you would have seen the employee engagement surveys that come out through HR departments. I don't know how many HR departments you've worked with. I assume you've worked with many, but often the problem is I'm seeing that they go and roll out these engagement surveys and then no action comes as a result of the effort that's been put in by the staff, and then they lose trust, back to what you were saying earlier, and then it's kind of a sort of vicious cycle. Are you seeing some of that as well? Is that sort of.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, the clients that I work with, one of the first things I'll say to them is, if you're not willing to act, don't ask.
Yeah.
So, and that doesn't mean that you know, need to act on everything that comes from an engagement survey at all, but rather it can actually do more damage to continue to do engagement surveys with no feedback loop, if you like, around thank you, we value your voice. These are the things that we're actioning. So I think there's that mutuality, if you like, that if you're asking people to invest in giving their opinion, we need to reciprocate that with that degree of respect of these are some of the actions that we're taking. But don't, and I think this is one of the fears that leaders will often have, is that perspective that unless I address everything that's in there, then we're not responding. And, you know, that's simply just not pragmatic in an organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes there's not enough budget to do everything that everybody wants to do. We typically, one of the things that we say for everything we do is show, don't tell. So show them give them an opportunity to be involved in the ongoing project, as you mentioned earlier, that change, and make it a continuous improvement initiative. Maybe it's rolling every year for year on year, and allowing them to see the changes, I think, would be very helpful as well. So, and build trust, back to what you mentioned earlier. You've done a lot of work in a number of different industries. You've worked in manufacturing and education and sporting and all of those different organizations in those industries. Does your approach change dependent on the industry, or just changes more on the company and the culture that you're working with?
Both and. So I would, and it's really interesting, whenever I talk to different industries, one of the first things that I'll hear is, oh, we work in nursing or we work in health. It's really different. It's really nuanced. Or we work in, you know, construction. It's a really different culture, a really different environment. And that is true. That is absolutely true. And yet both industries are made up of human beings. And human beings are human beings. So I would argue there are fundamentals that cross every human-centered system, whether that is, you know, a government or, you know, an organisation down to an individual, that fit across all. But what is really important, I think, in any kind of education program or change initiative is that, as we've already spoken about, it's meeting people where they're at. So I think language is fundamental. And it's why I say I don't like the term positive psychology. In fact, I never use that term with my clients, because it's very much around what does that mean for them, and how do we connect that with them in a way that makes sense in their context. You know, I could be talking to construction workers. I'm not going to talk about, let's all talk about the importance of, you know, mindfulness, for example, even though mindfulness is really fundamental. It's about how do we translate that language in a way that makes sense to them in their context.
Yeah, absolutely. My husband's a carpenter, and I often talk to him about sort of some of the things that go on in places he's worked over the years. And I just think, wow, that would not fly in the environments that I've kind of worked in. But you're right, you got to tailor it to their environment, which is absolutely fascinating and sometimes forgotten with change management programs I've seen as well. So that's quite interesting. What do you, in terms of wellbeing, why do you think wellbeing is at the core of performance and reaching potential?
Really good question. So there are like innumerable definitions of what wellbeing is, right? It depends on what perspective you actually look at it. But if I come back to distilling all of those down to the heart of what wellbeing is, I would say it's feeling good and functioning well.
Okay.
And so if it's those two things together, of course it sits at the heart of performance. You know, if I am anxious and I am, you know, unable to be able to see broadly the different opportunities that are in front of me, or I'm actually not even able to tune into what people are saying sitting next to me, then of course that's going to impact on my performance. You can't shut that off. It's actually part of who we are. So if we place wellbeing at the heart of, if I take care of and look after my team, then that actually flows out into a heightened level of performance. For me, that's the byproduct. Of course, I'm a psychologist. Of course, I'm going to say that. I also have, you know, run my own business and know how important profit is, right? It's actually the air, the oxygen that we breathe. But it's almost like horse and cart, if you like. If we put people at the center of that and take care of our people, they will also take care of the business.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember there was a study done by PwC a few years ago now that said for every dollar that an organization invests into sort of health and well-being, that there's a $2.50, I believe, return for the dollar, which is incredible. It's a great investment ultimately.
Absolutely. And that report also showed that the cost to Australian businesses of not doing it is $11 billion per annum. That's a pretty big number.
Wow. It's really interesting. I'm hoping that executives are listening now, thinking about how they can take some of these ideas and improve their business as a result, and the well-being of their staff. You mentioned running your business. So tell us about, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correct, but is it Merakai?
Oh, well done. Very impressive.
And so tell us what Merakai is, and where's the meaning of Merakai come from?
Very interesting question, and I'm so glad you asked me because it's actually the heart of why I even started this business in the first place. So the term we actually came up with this came from my children. After the story of actually coming up with our business name was we were driving down after I just made the decision to start this consultancy, and I was saying I need to come up with a name that really resonates. It's important for me that it reflects what the business is about. And so what do? I throw it out to my kids who are like, my board of directors. And so this will be like showing the age of when I started my business. So they went on Tumblr. Remember Tumblr?
Around.
I know. They went on Tumblr and actually came up with these cool words, like in other languages, that mean something that's meaningful. And what they came up with was the Greek word Maracai, which means to pour yourself, your heart, your soul, your creativity into your work so that it becomes an expression of you. I thought, that so stands for why I even started this business in the first place. I think that, if we can create workplace environments that allow people to actually bring themselves, the best of themselves, to the business, not only does that business become an expression of the founders, but it becomes an expression of all the extraordinary people that, are part of that organization, and the gifts that and the talents and unique strengths that they have that can actually really create a thriving environment. And so, the business started from my kids in that sense, or the business name started from my kids in that sense. But effectively, as I said, I am dual. I'm half with the University of Melbourne in education space, and I still continue to do consultation work. And that typically will take the form of education programs for organisations that, as I said, are bespoke or tailored to what their unique needs are. But I also do consultation with them as well. So sometimes it's not about education, it's actually about consulting with leaders to really be able to support them to really ingrain what they're looking to achieve within their teams. And I do some individual coaching as well with that.
Amazing. It's a good story, and it's really great when you come up with something that stems from your family, who are ultimately the support for your business. One of the things that I wanted to touch on is entrepreneurship is hard. Running your own business is hard, and if you're like me, not having a co-founder or anything like that, sometimes it could be quite lonely. What, if any, advice do you have for entrepreneurs that are running their own business that kind of on their own a lot of the time to manage their stress levels?
Yeah. One of the first things I would say is it's really fundamental that you find your own tribe. And I think that it's, particularly for solopreneurs where, we don't necessarily have a team and we are working and, like the be all and end all of everything. It's really important to make sure that you've got like connection points to be able to bounce those ideas, right? Because we are social beings by nature. And I certainly experienced this myself when I first started my consultancy, that, I thought it's great. I still got that connection with my clients that is giving me that fuel that I need. But when it comes to inspiring and thinking about the challenges of running my business, I actually need a mastermind group, if you like a wisdom tribe or council that I can go to really be able to bounce some of those ideas that enhance my practice and hopefully will also enhance others' practice as well. So I would say seek your own wisdom tribe.
Amazing. I think that's good advice. Even if it's a handful of people that you constantly reach out to and maybe help you out, and you help them out, because you can't do everything on your own when you're solopreneur, as you mentioned earlier. I think one of the things I wanted to touch on is just around your coaching. So when you are looking at providing coaching and supporting either organizations or individuals, what factors do you consider? Is there anything that you look at, like experience or goals or stability, or any particular elements that you look for? when
Yeah. Yeah. So my coaching approach is very much a strength-based approach. And that's based on the evidence, because we know that when we put people back in touch with and looking at creative ways that they can leverage their strengths, not only do they feel better themselves, but they actually function far better in multiple domains of their life. So I would say that one of the first things that I would do with clients is we actually do like a goal setting meet and greet session, where we're actually looking at what is it they're looking to achieve from coaching. Because one of the things that's really important for me, and I say this not just at an individual coaching level where that relationship is foundational, right? Like if we don't have a good fit from a coaching relationship perspective, it's just not going to work. Like there's just absolutely no point in going forward. So I always think that's really important. Equally, I would say I also do that with organizations too, right? So I think if I'm not the right fit for what an organization or what an individual are looking to achieve, then there's no point in going forward. So that's really important part of the process, I think. And then the design of our coaching sessions is then very much tailored to what the individual is looking to achieve, and then drawing on some of the evidence-based strategies to help them achieve those goals.
That's amazing. I think you touched on a really important point that sometimes, and there's a lot of coaching thrown out there, and there's a lot of coaches everywhere, and it's really positive that if you're not the right fit for the client, or the client's not the right fit for you, that you're calling that out. You're not just working with anyone and everyone just because it's a need. So I think having that as a sort of precursor, maybe an initial discussion or whatever it might be, to actually think if they're the right fit. It's the same with general. I assume your general sort of psychology clients. If I've seen psychologists in the past, if they're not the right fit, you need to find the right person, because you need to be comfortable and build up that trust.
Absolutely. And I think the nature of the work that I do, the relationship is foundational, right? Like if that's not right, then neither of us are going to achieve what we're actually looking for in that partnership. So I think that coaching or a psychology client partnership or an education provider and an organization, we're talking partnership. It's not one person doing unto another, but rather it's a collaborative approach. And therefore, if the fit is not right, it doesn't matter what skills and talents you have, it's not going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're spot on with that. So what's on the agenda for 2021? Is there a sort of a focus in the sort of education space based on the events of last year that maybe the university and yourself are looking at, or is there any particular projects of interest that you want to share?
So yes, there is lots on the agenda for 2021. That's why I said I'm very pleased that I've had 3 weeks to kind of catch my breath before we launch into another really huge year. There's a couple of things that are on the horizon. One of the things that has really come out of the need to flip the way we approach education has been a shift in the quality of our online education offering. And so from the university's perspective, we've invested heavily in being able to build really interactive online platforms to be able to support not just our students, but actually our staff as well too. We're actually developing an initiative to really be able to promote how we can enhance wellbeing from a staffing level as well, which I think is really important. And we need to build those capabilities for people to understand how they can embed that within the ways in which they're teaching. So that's a really exciting initiative that is kicking off that we're doing. In my own business, I, again, have kind of been translating a lot of what I've always done face-to-face into a series of online offerings. And I'm kind of excited about that. Last year, I was kind of in overwhelm mode of, wow, like this is a significant investment in time for me to be able to flip that. But this year, I now have a sense of real excitement about the reach that can actually provide and the additional support resources, therefore, I can provide to my clients.
Amazing. I think you're right on the money there with the consultancy remotely. Doing that over Zoom and whatnot has not been something that would have ever been considered, at least in my sort of career. I've never ever seen it as something that would be, acceptable. But now it's been so much more open, and I think it's opened a lot of doors, and like you said, reach globally. And I also love the idea around sort of flipping around the education space. I think it's necessary because of what's been going on and having students not be able to attend the premises and whatnot. But I think it's actually needed for the education space. There's been a lot of articles written about the education space needs to transform to keep up with the time. So the fact that they're doing some investment and being a bit more innovative in that space is actually really, really favourable, and I think positive for the students to come.
Oh, absolutely. And it's been fascinating to kind of see that translate right in an institution that is not typically agile. Like things take a long, long, long time to shift in a university. And I was delighted that I was invited to be part of a think tank in our faculty in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education last year. And we actually have a book that's being rushed through to be published to be able to look at how we actually shift the education to not only look at, academic performance, but equally to be looking at wellbeing and what are some of the strategies and ways in which we can do that. As I said, in a way that draws on all that we know about excellence in online education. Because it's not just about being the talk fest, right? It's actually about action.
Well, you've got a book coming out effectively. I'm keen to know, if you can share the title, or maybe we can get some details on that. We can share it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, look, it's not going through the publisher until March, but I'll really happily do a follow-up and share that with you once we've got
Perfect.
those details.
Sounds really, really fascinating. No, that sounds really good. I think there's been a lot of interesting things that have come out of last year. It's definitely accelerated people's uptake of being agile and doing iterative improvement and continuously improving, as opposed to sort of the traditional 5-year programs that universities typically undertake. I'm seeing a lot more of an increase in the way that they deliver projects and change. So I think that's positive for not only the staff, but also the students and, their shareholders as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. So tell us then, how can people get involved with your work? How can they reach you? Where can they get more information?
Yeah, sure. So if we're sort of thinking from an individual perspective, as I mentioned, I do individual coaching work with clients. But if people are looking for the more individual education process, I direct you to the work that I do at the University of Melbourne. So we have a professional certificate in positive psychology that is specifically designed at an entry level for organisations. It's really relevant to leaders that are looking at how they can actually build that capability within their team. And it's very pragmatic. We also offer a master's program as well in Masters of Applied Positive Psychology, which is at a much more in-depth level. So I do recommend that the Prof Cert is a really great way of getting that entry level into that.
Beautiful. That sounds amazing. And we'll make sure to share your details in the show notes as well, and a link to your website as well. Thank you so much. I guess my last question would be, is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners, a call to action, a piece of advice, or a question to ponder?
Yes, there's probably two things I would say. One of the things I would say is there is a fundamental, and you're going to get a biased opinion here, but just so you know, one of the most underestimated factors, I think, of wellbeing science that has really risen to the forefront this year that I think is so important is the importance of hope. And I say that I'm biased because I'm a hope researcher. And so we have seen significant impact that hope can actually have, not just in terms of wellbeing, but it's really fundamental, important connection to performance at a variety of different levels. And I think this year we've truly understood how important hope is from a resilience perspective as well. So the one thing I would say to your listeners is, what can they do in their life to be able to ignite that sense of hope, and how can they actually build those strategies? And I'm very happy to support with that. We're continuing to build out resources on our website to be able to support listeners in terms of their hope strategies and ways that they can actually implement that at an individual level as well as at an organisational level. So I guess that's one call to action, is really reflecting on that. If I was to leave you with a question, it's a question that I actually asked myself, and it's really come out of my reflections of last year. The question I would ask people is, if you had to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how important your well-being is in your life, where would you rate it?
Very, very good question.
And the follow-up question is, how well does your current action reflect how well you rate it? Is there actually alignment between how important you think it is in your life and the actions and the investment that you actually put into it?
It's a very, very, very good question. I think the first part of your question, people probably would say what I was going to say, number 1. And then this follow-up question is so important, because I'm thinking in my head about answering it, thinking, wow, it's actually far off what I did last year, and it's needs to change this year, which is one of my personal goals as well. So it's a really, really good takeaway point.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rachel. I can say on behalf of the listeners, we really appreciate it. I'm sure there'll be some people following you up on LinkedIn and on your website and whatnot. And from what I've heard, the students love you. So thank you. Really appreciate your time. And I hope you have a really amazing 2021.
Thank you. And I extend the same, as I said, that, the takeaway of what to leave you with is hope. That is exactly my hope for all your listeners, is they have the opportunity to really be able to consider how they can make the most of this year.
Amazing. Thank you so much.